Hello and welcome. You're here to relax, to drift off gently as we walk slowly through the past. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most important and heartbreaking chapters in human history, the story of World War I. But don't worry, you don't have to stay awake for it. You can simply listen, let the story flow, and if sleep comes, that's perfectly okay. This is history for quiet minds. A peaceful place to rest, even while learning something new. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin. What was World War I? World War I, also called the Great War, was a conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen before. It began in the summer of 1914 and lasted for over 4 long, bitter years, ending in late 1918. It was a war that involved more than 30 nations, stretched across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and caused the deaths of over 16 million people. But World War I wasn't just a war of soldiers and generals. It was a war of industry, of empires, of civilians caught in the crossfire, a war that changed the map of the world, a war that shaped the entire 20th century. And yet, it all started from something so small. To understand the war, we need to go back a little further. Before the trenches, before the battles, back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. The world then was changing rapidly. Steam trains carved through the countryside. Electric lights lit up cities for the first time. Telephones were just beginning to ring, and factories' great roaring machines were churning out steel, coal, and power. This was the age of industrialization, and it transformed everything. Empires stretched across continents. Britain controlled India, Canada, large parts of Africa. France had colonies in Southeast Asia and North Africa. Germany, a newer empire, was rising quickly, hungry for power and respect. And then there was Austria-Hungary, a vast and old empire full of different peoples, languages, and ambitions. Russia, too, was growing and struggling. And in the Far East, the Ottoman Empire was weakening but still very much alive. Europe in many ways saw itself as the center of the world. But beneath the surface, there was tension, and fear, and pride. By 1900, Europe's most powerful nations had formed alliances. These were meant to keep peace, to say, if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. But they also created a delicate, dangerous web. There were 2 major groups, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These alliances weren't just political. They were military promises. If war broke out, no country would be alone. The idea was to prevent fighting by making it too costly to even try. But in reality, it made everything far more explosive. There were 3 powerful forces growing quietly during this time. Nationalism, the belief that your nation, your people, your culture is superior. Across Europe, nationalism burned like a quiet fire. In France, memories of past wars with Germany stirred anger. In Serbia, Slavic pride pushed for independence and unification. In Germany, a young empire wanted its place in the sun, to be respected, to be feared. Then there was militarism, the belief in the power of armies. Nations raced to build bigger navies, stronger weapons, and more soldiers. Generals had plans, ready detailed schedules for mobilization, like chess games waiting to begin. It wasn't a question of if there would be war, but when. And finally, imperialism, the scramble for colonies. Africa was carved up by European powers, often without a thought for the people who lived there. Tensions rose in Asia, the Middle East, even the Pacific. Everywhere, empires pushed outward and rubbed up against one another. Despite all of this, many still believed that real war, was impossible. Europe was too modern, too civilized, too advanced. There were royal families, parliament buildings, international treaties. Even the Kaiser of Germany was related to the King of Britain. Surely that mattered. And yet, it was this very sense of stability that made the coming war so shocking. Imagine Europe in 1913 like a grand house of cards. Elegant, complex, but fragile. The wrong word, the wrong move, the wrong moment, and the whole thing could collapse. And that moment would come very soon. But before it did, the world had no idea what was about to unfold. While the governments and generals prepared for conflict, ordinary people lived their lives. Children played in cobblestone streets. Farmers worked in golden fields. Women sewed and wrote letters and taught school. Workers organized, writers published, artists dreamed. There were early signs of rebellion and reform. The labor movement was growing. Socialist ideas were spreading. Suffragettes marched in London and Paris, demanding the right to vote. In Russia, quiet storms brewed beneath the surface of the Tsar's empire. In this world, modern and medieval at once, a single gunshot would soon ignite a war that no one could control. So, before we continue deeper into this story, let's gently remember where we are. The world in the early 1900s was full of promise and pressure. Nations were growing, proud and ambitious. Empires stretched far and wide. Technology was reshaping everything. But fear, rivalry, and mistrust were just below the surface. And in a small corner of Europe, in a place called the Balkans, the spark was about to fall. Next, we'll go to the city of Sarajevo, where a carriage, a wrong turn, and a young man with a pistol changed the course of history forever. The world in the summer of 1914 was warm and bright. Most people had no idea what was coming. They tended their gardens, attended weddings, walked to work, and far away in a quiet corner of southeastern Europe, history held its breath. Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. The city of Sarajevo lay nestled in the mountains, a mix of east and west mosques beside churches, cobblestone streets lined with old wooden houses. It was here, on June 28, 1914, that the first domino fell. That morning, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in the city with his wife, Sophie. They were there on official business, inspecting the imperial army stationed in Bosnia. But it was also a kind of date. The couple were very much in love and rarely seen together in public. Their marriage had been frowned upon by royal circles, but on this day, they were together, in the open, riding in a motorcar, smiling and waving. What they didn't know was that a group of young men were waiting for them. Nationalists. Teenagers, really. Serbian radicals who believed Bosnia should be free of Austro-Hungarian rule. They had been armed and trained by a shadowy group known as the Black Hand, a secret military society in Serbia. Among them was a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. Thin, pale, sick with tuberculosis, but burning with purpose. They stood quietly along the motorcade route, each one holding a pistol or a grenade. The Archduke's car passed the first one, then the second. Then a grenade was thrown, but it missed. It bounced off the folded roof of Franz Ferdinand's car and exploded under the vehicle behind him. Chaos erupted. The motorcade sped away and people screamed, blood on the street. The Archduke and his wife were shaken but unhurt. And so they changed their plans. Later that morning, they decided to visit the wounded in the hospital. The driver, confused, took a wrong turn. He stopped to reverse right in front of a small cafe. And standing just outside that cafe was Gavrilo Princip. He couldn't believe his eyes. This was not the plan. But the car had stopped right in front of him. He stepped forward, raised his pistol. 2 shots. One struck Sophie. The other hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Both would die within minutes. The crowd froze. then panic, and the world began to tremble. The assassination of an archduke in a distant province might seem like a local tragedy, a regional affair. But this was no ordinary time. Austria-Hungary was enraged. They blamed Serbia, and not just the gunmen, but the entire government. They demanded justice. But behind the scenes, they wanted more than that. They saw an opportunity to crush Serbia and assert dominance in the Balkans. But there was a problem. Serbia had a protector, a powerful friend: Russia. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivered a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. 10 strict demands, including allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to operate freely inside Serbia. It was meant to be unacceptable. But Serbia, surprisingly, agreed to most of the terms. All except one, the part that would give Austria control over internal investigations. They couldn't accept that. It would be a loss of sovereignty. So Austria declared war. Now the dominoes began to fall. Russia mobilized its army to protect Serbia. Germany, Austria's ally, saw this as a threat. They warned Russia to stop. But Russia didn't back down. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Then Germany declared war on France, Russia's ally. To reach France quickly, German troops marched through Belgium, a neutral country. This brought Britain into the war. Britain had promised to protect Belgium's neutrality. Within days, almost all of Europe was at war. How did this happen so fast? In many ways, it wasn't just the assassination. It was the misreading of intentions, the clumsy diplomacy, the trust in rigid military plans. Nations believed they had no choice, that if they hesitated, they would be vulnerable. And so they acted quickly, sometimes blindly. Diplomatic cables crossed borders filled with warnings, pleas, and threats. Leaders made decisions from summer palaces, from train compartments, from midnight meetings. And none of them truly understood what they were unleashing. Many believed the war would be short. Home by Christmas, they said. But this war would not be like the others. Because this time it wasn't just armies on horseback or rifles in ranks. This time there were machine guns and poison gas, barbed wire, trains delivering troops by the thousands, battleships with steel hulls and massive guns. The modern world had arrived, but no one was ready for what it could do. So here we are, at the edge of the abyss. A single bullet from a teenager's pistol set off a chain reaction that pulled the world into darkness. It wasn't just about one man's death. It was about pride, power, fear, and the fragile web of alliances that had been stretched too far. Moving ahead, we'll follow the soldiers as they march to war. We'll see the excitement, the parades, the belief that glory was ahead. But that belief would not last long. The storm had broken. By August of 1914, Europe, once filled with embassies and treaties, had become a continent of soldiers, railroads, and rifles. The alliances had held but not for peace. Instead, they had bound nations to conflict like links in a heavy chain. The war had begun. When Austria declared war on Serbia and Germany declared war on Russia and France, armies across the continent sprang into motion. Mobilization was not instant, it was massive. Millions of men summoned from farms, from cities, from shops and schools. Posters went up on walls, church bells rang, and young men lined up to serve their countries. In Germany, in France, in Britain, there was cheering, music, waving flags. People truly believed that the war would be quick, maybe just a few weeks. They spoke of honor, of duty, of defending the homeland. They carried flowers. And in their backpacks, letters from mothers, photographs of sweethearts, and the silent hope that they would return. Germany had been preparing for war for years. They had a strategy detailed, precise, almost mechanical. It was called the Schlieffen Plan. The plan assumed that Germany would fight two enemies, France in the west and Russia in the east, but they also assumed that Russia would be slow to mobilize. So Germany would strike France first quickly, decisively, before turning around to deal with Russia. To do this, they would invade Belgium, a neutral country, and swing down into northern France like a hammer. This move, though fast, would come at a terrible cost. Because Belgium was neutral, and its neutrality had been guaranteed by Britain, Germany believed Britain might stay out. They were wrong. On August 4th, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium. The next day, Britain declared war on Germany. The war was no longer continental. It was global. The British Empire stretched around the world: India, Africa, Canada, Australia. And soon, its people would be called to fight. Across the seas, dominions and colonies read the headlines, and the great machinery of empire began to move. German troops marched through Belgium with brutal efficiency. Villages were burned, civilians were executed. Germany called it necessary, but the world saw it as barbaric. Belgium resisted with surprising strength. Its small army slowed the Germans down just enough. The French, meanwhile, charged into Alsace-Lorraine, hoping for a quick victory. But they were pushed back, bloodied. The Germans kept advancing into France, nearing Paris. And then in early September came a battle that would change everything. The French and British armies made a stand on the Marne River just outside of Paris. Taxicabs from the city were used to rush troops to the front. It was desperate, chaotic, but it worked. The German advance stalled. And then something strange happened. Both sides began to dig. Trenches were dug for protection, shallow at first, then deeper, more elaborate. Lines were reinforced. Barbed wire stretched across the fields. Machine gun nests were built. Artillery was brought up. And the war, which had started with motion, began to slow. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, a jagged scar was forming across Europe. This would become known as the Western Front. Let's slow down here and imagine. Imagine the long columns of men marching down dusty roads, their boots heavy with mud, their uniforms still new, still clean. They sing as they go, marching songs full of pride. They wave to children. They smile at the future. They do not know what waits for them. The trenches, the shells, the cold, the gas, the endless days and nights of thunder and silence. They still believe as their commanders do in a short, noble war. But the fields ahead will teach them something else. At the start, war still held a strange romance. It was seen as heroic, a proving ground for men, a way to serve, to be brave, to be remembered. Newspapers printed patriotic poems, artists painted cavalry charges, schoolboys dreamed of medals, but that dream would not last. Soon the war would be rain, and rot, and rats. It would be machine guns that never stopped firing, gas masks pulled on in panic, letters home written in trembling hands. It would be boredom and terror and the scream of shells at 3 a.m. The romance of war was a lie, and it was about to unravel. Unlike the wars before it, this would not be fought only by soldiers. This would be total war. Nations would pour everything they had into the effort men, machines, money. Factories would shift from making furniture to making bullets. Women would take jobs in railways and shipyards. Rationing would begin. Propaganda would rise. This was not just a military fight. It was political, economic, psychological, and it was just beginning. So here we are, at the very beginning of a war that would take millions of lives and change the world forever. A war that was supposed to be over by Christmas, but would stretch on year after year. And the soldiers, the young men who marched so proudly in August, would soon be buried in mud and memory. As move forward, we'll walk with them into the trenches. We'll hear the silence and the guns, and we'll begin to understand what the Western Front truly was. As autumn fell over Europe in 1914, the war that had begun with marching bands and banners had changed. The front lines had stretched and curled and cracked, and now they stopped. From the shores of the North Sea in Belgium, all the way down to the mountains of Switzerland, a jagged line was carved into the earth. This was the Western Front, and it would hardly move for 4 long years. At first, the trenches were simple shallow cuts in the dirt, dug in a hurry, a way to protect soldiers from bullets and shells. But as both sides settled in, the digging deepened. Lines of trenches were fortified, reinforced, expanded. There were front-line trenches just meters from the enemy, support trenches where supplies and reinforcements gathered, and reserve lines farther back to rest and regroup. Between them were narrow, winding paths, communication trenches, like veins in the earth. Soldiers spent weeks, even months, carving them out with picks and shovels. And soon this hidden world stretched for hundreds of miles. A buried battlefield. Let's slow down now and step into the trench. It is cold. The air is thick with damp earth, sweat, and smoke. Walls made of mud and sandbags rise around you. The floor is slick with rain and waste. Wooden planks called duck boards keep your boots from sinking too deep, but sometimes they don't help. And then there are the rats. Not small ones, but fat, gray things the size of cats. They live in the walls, feed on scraps, and sometimes on the fallen. Lice crawl in every uniform seam, and trench foot, a painful rotting condition, comes from standing too long in cold water. Sleep is broken. Food is simple, stale biscuits, cold tea, tinned meat. Letters from home are rare. Rain never seems to end. And above all, there is the noise. Day and night, artillery echoes across the sky. Shells whine overhead, explode with a dull, deafening thud. Sometimes they hit miles away, sometimes just meters. Soldiers flinch, dig deeper, wait for silence. And in that silence comes the fear. The knowledge that at any moment a whistle might blow. And it'll be time to go over the top. Between the trenches lies a stretch of ground that belongs to no one, and to death. No man's land. Sometimes only 30 yards wide down, sometimes hundreds. It is a torn, muddy field of craters, wire, broken wood and bones. Barbed wire tangles in twisted shapes. Corpses lie where they fell. Shell holes fill with rain. Ghosts of battle linger in the mist. Crossing it is near suicide, and yet that is what men are ordered to do. In late 1914, the town of Ypres in Belgium became the scene of fierce fighting. German and Allied forces clashed again and again. The town was flattened, the dead countless, but the line did not break. And then something terrible happened. In 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, a new weapon was unleashed. On a quiet afternoon, the wind shifted. German troops opened metal canisters and released a strange greenish-yellow cloud. It rolled across no man's land toward French lines. This was chlorine gas. The soldiers didn't understand at first. Then came coughing, choking, the burning of eyes and lungs. Panic, screams, collapse. Gas had arrived. Later came phosgene and then mustard gas, which blistered the skin, blinded the eyes, and lingered for days. Gas masks were issued, but nothing could erase the terror. This was a new kind of war. Back in 1914, at the First Battle of the Marne, the German advance was stopped. Paris was saved, but the cost was high. Thousands died on both sides. The rivers ran dark, and the trenches began. Years later, another battle, the Second Marne, would come, but for now, the first had locked the Western Front in place. So now, we reach a bitter truth. The war had become a stalemate. Both sides dug in. Both sides bled, and neither could break the line. Each offensive brought only small gains at massive cost. Thousands lost to capture a few yards. It was a war of attrition, a slow, grinding machine that devoured men, horses, steel, and time. Commanders hoped each new attack would end it, but each one only deepened the wound. Between battles, the soldiers waited. They played cards, wrote letters, carved names into rifle butts and trench walls. They watched the skies, listened for the whistle, prayed for the next leave or the next sunrise. And in the quiet moments, they thought of home, of warm bread, of clean sheets, of children laughing in summer fields. They dreamed, even as the guns waited in silence. This was not the war their fathers had known. This was not cavalry charges and gleaming swords. This was industrial war, cold, mechanized, relentless. War as factory. War as endurance. War as mud, wire, and fire. And it was only the beginning. The Western Front had frozen. But the world had not. In distant places, in deserts, seas, and skies, new fronts would open, and soldiers from faraway lands would soon join the fight. India, Australia, Africa, Canada. A war that began in Europe would soon touch every corner of the earth. The trenches of France and Belgium were only one part of the war. Beyond Europe's fields of mud and wire, the conflict stretched outward, touching deserts, jungles, islands, and oceans. This was not just a European war anymore. It was a global war. When the fighting began in 1914, the European empires pulled their colonies into the struggle. In Africa, German colonies became targets for Allied forces. German East Africa, what is now Tanzania, saw a long, grueling campaign. British, South African, Indian, and African soldiers fought through jungle and savanna. In the deserts of German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, South African troops clashed with German forces under the blazing sun. And in West Africa, French and British troops seized German outposts, often with the help and the sacrifice of local soldiers. For many African communities, this war was not theirs to fight, yet it demanded their men, their resources, their land. The fighting reached Asia quickly. Japan, bound by an alliance with Britain, declared war on Germany in August 1914. They moved swiftly, seizing German-controlled ports in China, including Qingdao, and German-held islands in the Pacific. In the South Seas, Australian forces captured German possessions in New Guinea. New Zealand troops occupied Samoa. For the people living there, the change of flags meant little at first. But it was a reminder the war's reach was vast, and no shore was too far. In late 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers Germany and Austria-Hungary. Its entry shifted the map of the conflict dramatically. The Ottomans controlled key waterways and stood between the Allies and Russia. This led to one of the war's most famous and tragic campaigns, Gallipoli. The Allies hoped to open a sea route to Russia by forcing the Dardanelles Strait. In April 1915, they landed troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers, the Anzacs, came ashore under heavy fire. The cliffs above were lined with Ottoman defenders commanded by Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. What followed was months of grinding, hopeless fighting in the heat and dust. Men lived in trenches cut into the rock under constant sniper fire. Water was scarce. Flies swarmed over the dead. By January 1916, the Allies withdrew. The campaign had failed. Tens of thousands were dead. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a defining moment, a symbol of sacrifice and endurance. For the Ottomans, it was a rare and significant victory. While armies dug into the earth, the war at sea raged across oceans. The British Royal Navy enforced a blockade of Germany, cutting off supplies of food and raw materials. Slowly, hunger spread through German cities. Germany struck back with a new weapon, the U-boat or submarine. Silent beneath the waves, they attacked merchant ships bringing food and weapons to Britain. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the British liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people, including Americans. The sinking shocked the world and pushed the United States closer to joining the war. In 1916, the British and German fleets clashed off the coast of Denmark in the Battle of Jutland. It was the largest naval battle of the war. For hours, massive ships exchanged thunderous fire. When it was over, both sides claimed victory, but neither gained control of the seas. The blockade remained, and the U-boat war continued. Far from the trenches of Europe, life in the colonies was changing. Men were recruited or conscripted to fight in distant lands. Resources were taken for the war effort: grain, minerals, livestock. In India, over 1 million soldiers served the British Empire, fighting in France, the Middle East, and Africa. Many never returned. For civilians, the war meant shortages, higher taxes, and sometimes famine. And for some, it planted seeds of political change, the idea that sacrifice in war should lead to greater rights or independence. Across the seas, nations of the British Empire rallied to the cause. Australia and New Zealand sent their young men halfway around the world. They fought in Gallipoli, in the Middle East, and later on the Western Front. Canada's soldiers distinguished themselves in battles like Vimy Ridge, but paid dearly in lives lost. These nations began the war as parts of an empire. They would end it with a stronger sense of their own identity. By the end of 1916, the war touched every ocean, every continent, from the deserts of Sinai to the jungles of Africa, from the icy North Sea to the warm Pacific Islands. It was truly a world war. But the heart of the conflict, the bloodiest battle, still lay in Europe. And there, something darker was beginning to emerge. The weapons were evolving. The offensives were growing larger, and the cost was climbing higher than anyone had imagined. Now, we will return to the Western Front. We'll look at the machines, the inventions, the terrible ingenuity of war. War had always been cruel. But in the early 20th century, cruelty was refined, mechanized, perfected into something vast and impersonal. This was the age of the machine, and on the battlefields of the Great War, the machine became king. In the old wars, a skilled soldier could fire 3 shots in a minute. Now one weapon could unleash hundreds in seconds. The machine gun was simple in shape but deadly in purpose. Its steady, hammering rhythm tore through lines of men before they ever reached the wire. Defenses hardened, offensives slowed, and the killing multiplied. Around the trenches, an old invention became a new weapon. Barbed wire, twisted metal strands studded with sharp points. It was cheap. It was quick to lay. And it was almost impossible to cross under fire. At night, patrols crept out to repair or extend it. In the morning, the dead could be seen tangled in its grasp, motionless, silent. By 1916, the stalemate cried out for something new. And so the tank appeared. At first, they were strange creatures, armored boxes on tracks, lumbering forward at walking pace. They could cross trenches, crush wire, and shrug off small arms fire. But they were hot inside, noisy, and unreliable. Still, their arrival on the Somme hinted at the future. A future where steel and oil, not horses, would carry war forward. In 1914, planes were fragile things, wooden frames covered in fabric, engines rattling like sewing machines. At first, they were used only to watch from above, spotting enemy troops, sketching maps. Then someone brought a pistol, and soon after a machine gun. Aerial combat had arrived. Dogfights, twisting duels in the sky became a new form of battle. The names of pilots like the Red Baron spread across newspapers, wrapped in a strange, romantic glow. But there was nothing romantic about falling from the clouds. From observation, the planes turned to attack. They dropped small bombs on trenches, supply lines, and cities. Zeppelins. Vast airships floated over London, dropping explosives in the night. People ran to cellars as sirens wailed. For the first time, war reached deep into civilian streets from the air. We've seen it before at Ypres, but gas returned again and again in many forms. Chlorine, a choking cloud that burned the lungs. Phosgene, deadlier, quieter, and mustard gas which blistered skin, blinded eyes, and could linger in the soil for days. Masks were issued, strange snouted shapes that made soldiers look like creatures from a nightmare. But sometimes there was no time to put them on. Even years later, survivors coughed from scarred lungs. Eyes watered at sudden winds. The memory never left. Where the machines destroyed, the healers worked. Nurses, many from volunteer corps, staffed hospitals near the front and in the rear. They tended shattered limbs, burns, and the endless flow of fever and infection. The war pushed medicine forward. Blood transfusions became more common. X-rays were used to find bullets and shrapnel. Plastic surgery took its first steps, helping men whose faces had been torn apart. But there were wounds no scalpel could reach. Men returned from the front, unable to speak. Hands trembled. Eyes stared into nothing. They flinched at sudden noises, even a slammed door. It was called shell shock then. Today we know it as post-traumatic stress disorder. In an age that prized stoicism, many saw it as weakness. But doctors were beginning to understand the mind, too, can be wounded. And those wounds can last far longer than the war. If you stood on a battlefield of 1916, you would see the old and the new together. Men with bayonets charging across open fields, and beside them tanks grinding forward. Cavalry squadrons trotting toward the horizon, while above planes circled like hawks, horses pulling supply wagons, and in the distance, the cough of a machine gun nest. It was a moment between centuries, the twilight of one kind of war and the dawn of another. The Great War had begun with dreams of glory. But now, it was a contest of endurance between flesh and steel. Now we'll leave the battlefield itself and see how entire nations were drawn into the fight. The factories, the fields, the families left behind. Because in this war, no one was untouched. A war is not fought only on the front lines. In the fields and factories, in kitchens and classrooms, entire nations bent themselves toward the conflict. This was total war where every person, every resource, every waking hour was drawn into the struggle. By 1915, life for civilians had changed completely. Rationing became part of the daily routine. In Britain, sugar, butter, and meat were measured carefully. In Germany, bread was stretched with potato flour, sometimes even sawdust. Queues formed outside shops in the early morning. Empty shelves became common. Lighting was dimmed in coastal cities in case of air raids. Newspapers carried fewer details about the fighting. Censorship ensured only the right news was printed. The war was far away for some, yet present in every meal, every conversation, every letter from the front. Governments knew they needed more than armies. They needed belief. They needed unity. And so the streets bloomed with propaganda posters. Bright colors, bold words, a soldier pointing from the page. Your country needs you. A mother and child gazing upward. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? Posters encouraged enlistment, urged people to save food, and warned against careless talk. Politicians gave stirring speeches in crowded halls, their voices carried on early radio broadcasts. The enemy was painted as barbaric, the home nation as noble, righteous, and unbreakable. With millions of men at the front, the factories and fields could not be left idle. Women stepped into roles once considered impossible for them. They worked in munitions plants, their hands stained yellow from handling explosives. They drove trams, delivered mail, ran farms, and staffed offices. Nurses served in war hospitals, sometimes only a few miles from the front lines. This transformation was profound. Many women experienced independence for the first time, earning wages, managing responsibilities, proving their capability in every sphere. When the war ended, some would be expected to return quietly to their old roles. But the change could not be entirely undone. Far to the east, the war was pushing an empire toward collapse. In Russia, food shortages deepened. Factories struggled to keep up with the demand for weapons. Soldiers, poorly supplied and badly led, suffered staggering losses. The Tsar's government faced growing unrest. Strikes and protests broke out in the cities. In Petrograd, whispers of revolution grew louder. While the full storm had not yet broken, its winds were already felt. And soon, Russia's fate would reshape the entire war. Across all nations, the war was a weight pressing down on daily life. Governments borrowed heavily, taking on debts they could not yet imagine repaying. Taxes rose. Inflation crept upward, eroding the value of wages. Factories worked day and night. Children collected scrap metal and chestnuts for war materials. Every household was asked to give something: a blanket, a coin, a son. At first, the war was carried on a wave of patriotic energy. But as the months became years and the casualty lists grew longer, a quieter mood took hold. There was pride, yes, but also weariness. And beneath it all, grief. Families learned to live with absence. A knock on the door could bring a telegram that changed everything. In towns and cities, memorials began to appear even before the war was over. Lists of names carved in stone, spaces left for names yet to come. Though there were no trenches in most cities, the home front was its own kind of battlefield. Here, the weapons were words, images, and endurance. Victory depended not just on the soldiers in the mud, but on the millions who kept the machine of war turning. The baker measuring out scarce flour. The mother writing letters in the dim light. The factory worker shaping the shell that would be fired hundreds of miles away. The war was no longer an adventure, nor even a season in the life of a nation. It had become the air they breathed, and still there was no end in sight. By 1917, the Great War had already consumed 3 long years. The trenches were scarred deeper, the casualty lists grew longer, and the spirit of nations began to fray. It was the year when the war would change forever. The Russian Empire had entered the war with pride and confidence. But by the winter of 1916, the cracks were already showing. Millions of soldiers were dead or wounded. The armies were undersupplied. Some men sent to the front without rifles, told to wait until a comrade fell before taking up a weapon. At home, hunger spread through the cities. Bread lines stretched down frozen streets. Whispers turned to shouts, and shouts became crowds. In March 1917, Petrograd erupted. Protesters demanded bread and peace. Soldiers sent to restore order instead joined the crowds. Within days, the centuries-old rule of the Tsars collapsed. Nicholas II abdicated, ending the Romanov dynasty. A provisional government took power, promising reform but also pledging to keep fighting the war. For many, that promise felt like a betrayal. In the shadows, another force gathered strength: the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. They offered a simple message: peace, land, and bread. On an autumn night they struck. The Winter Palace was seized. The provisional government fell. Now Russia's leaders were committed not to victory on the battlefield, but to ending the war entirely. In March 1918, the new Bolshevik government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. The price was steep, vast territories surrendered from Ukraine to the Baltic states. But for Russia, the war was over. Millions of soldiers began their long journey home. For Germany, this was a moment of hope. No more Eastern Front. The full weight of their armies could turn westward. While Russia was leaving the fight, another giant was stepping in. The United States had watched the conflict from across the Atlantic for nearly 3 years. But German unrestricted submarine warfare sinking ships without warning, including those carrying American passengers, began to shift opinion. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message promising Mexico the return of lost lands if it joined Germany against the United States. When the telegram was revealed, outrage swept across the country. On April 6, 1917, America declared war on Germany. For the Allies, American entry was a lifeline: fresh troops, immense industrial power, and financial support. For Germany, it was a race against time. They needed to win before America's strength could be fully brought to bear. In fields and factories, in ports and training camps, the United States began to mobilize at a scale never seen before in its history. The year 1917 was not only about political change, it was about the human spirit. In France, soldiers mutinied after disastrous offensives. They refused to attack, though they would defend their positions. In Britain, strikes broke out in war industries. In Austria-Hungary, food riots spread and ethnic tensions flared. Even in Germany, once so disciplined, there were signs of unrest. Naval crews muttered in the ports. Civilians grew weary under the weight of the blockade. The war had begun with flags and songs, but now the cheers had faded. Men at the front measured their time not in victories, but in the number of days they might survive. Civilians counted not the weeks until victory, but the meals until the next ration. The leaders spoke of endurance, sacrifice, and final pushes. But in every nation, a quiet question grew louder: how much longer? 1917 was a year of endings and beginnings. An empire fell. A revolution took root. A new nation joined the fight. The balance of the war shifted, though no one yet knew toward what end. After 4 long years, the war that had shaken the world was nearing its end. 1918 brought one last surge of fighting, a series of powerful pushes called the 100 Days Offensive. The Allies, now reinforced by fresh American troops and better equipped than ever, launched a coordinated series of attacks along the Western Front. From August through November, the Germans were pushed back, mile by mile. Tanks, airplanes, and artillery worked together in ways never seen before. The old stalemate finally began to break. One by one, Germany's allies began to crumble. Bulgaria signed an armistice in late September. The Ottoman Empire was next, surrendering in October. Austria-Hungary, weakened by internal strife and defeat, followed soon after. The Central Powers, once confident and strong, now faced collapse on all fronts. In October, Germany asked for an armistice. The country was exhausted. Food shortages were severe. Political unrest spread from the streets to the military. Leaders understood that continuing the fight meant ruin. Negotiations began quietly behind closed doors. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, the war finally stopped. The armistice came into effect at 11 a.m. Soldiers froze mid-fight. Guns fell silent across the battlefield stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. For the first time in over 4 years, the world breathed a collective sigh. In cities and villages, people poured into the streets. Flags waved, church bells rang, songs filled the air. Yet beneath the joy was a quiet sadness. The cost had been immense. Millions of men would never return home. Families grieved in silence, their losses etched forever in their hearts. The Great War had claimed an estimated 16 million lives. Another 21 million were wounded, many with scars seen and unseen. Entire generations had been marked by its toll. In the stillness after the fighting, the world began to reckon with what had been lost, and the hope fragile and trembling that such a war would never happen again. The guns may have fallen silent, but the echoes of the Great War would continue to ripple through history. The map of Europe was redrawn. Nations rose and fell. New conflicts simmered beneath the surface. The guns fell silent, but the world had only just begun to reckon with the Great War's aftermath. The peace was fragile, the wounds were deep, and the path forward was uncertain. In 1919, world leaders met at the Palace of Versailles. They sought to shape a lasting peace. The treaty was harsh. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. It lost territory, its military was limited, and it had to pay heavy reparations. For many, these terms planted the seeds of resentment and anger, a sense that justice had not been done, and that future conflict might yet arise. The map of Europe was redrawn, creating new countries from old empires. But many ethnic groups found themselves minorities in unfamiliar lands. Economic hardship and political instability spread. The memory of war's horrors haunted governments and citizens alike. Though peace had been declared, a fragile tension lingered, a reminder that history often moves in circles. One hopeful idea emerged. The League of Nations, an international body designed to prevent future wars through diplomacy and cooperation. Though its goals were noble, the League lacked real power, and key nations, including the United States, never fully joined. Still, it laid the groundwork for international cooperation in the decades to come. The Great War inspired voices that reached beyond the battlefield. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote haunting verses of sacrifice and sorrow. Artists captured the shattered landscapes and the pain of those who survived. Memorials rose across Europe, quiet stones engraved with thousands of names, each a story, a life, a loss. These works of memory remind us not just of the war itself, but of its human cost. The First World War reshaped the 20th century. It changed how wars were fought. It altered societies and governments. It shifted borders and ideologies. And it left a legacy that echoes through history, a warning and a lesson. That the cost of conflict is always greater than we can imagine. Thank you for listening to this story told softly, so you might drift into sleep with the past as your companion. May your rest be peaceful, and your dreams carry you beyond the echoes of history. Good night, and sleep well. And sleep.